Hello everyone, and welcome to today's NextGen webinar. I am Maureen McCarthy, the Associate Director of Advancement and Best Practices at the Council of Graduate Schools and the Project Liaison for the NextGen Consortium, as I hope you know. Today, before we get started, I'm going to just do our standard audio troubleshooting slides. If you're having trouble hearing us, you can switch from telephone to mic and speakers or vice versa without leaving the session. And if you are having trouble with your telephone connection, you can get a different number to dial in. So today's webinar is a little bit different than all of our past webinars. We're calling it a workshop, and it is going to last 2 hours instead of our usual one. And because it's a workshop setting, we really encourage you to actively participate, push back, ask questions. And so to do that, we ask that you use the raise your hand function if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. And then I would recognize you verbally and unmute you when it was your turn to speak. You can also, if you're having trouble with your audio or if you'd rather not, if you don't have a microphone or for whatever reason, you can also type in a question or a comment in the questions field, and I will read it out for you. So either way, so today's session is called Diversity in the Humanities Ecosystem, and the idea for this webinar arose out of the project directors meeting that we had back in January, where we began some important and serious conversations about representation in the NextGen programs and NextGen leadership. And I think that it is a challenge for NextGen programs, but like we have this challenge and we must go forth and do it. But to think about how we might structure these programs to mitigate rather than exacerbate the effects of institutionalized discrimination against historically underrepresented groups, but also to meet students' differing needs, which the overwhelming evidence is that this way of thinking will benefit all students, even the most privileged or traditional, and not just those. Yes, Katya has said it is a challenge grant after all. That is very true. Thank you, Katya. Exactly. And so this way of thinking really helps everyone, not just those you might think of as underrepresented or discriminated against. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, or our facilitator for the workshop, Patricia A. Matthew. She's the Associate Professor of English at Montclair State University, and she's the editor of the recently published Written Unwritten, Diversity and the Hidden Truths of Tenure. And you may be thinking that it is strange to invite someone who wrote a book about tenure and promotion to work with a group explicitly committed to advancing the agenda that PhD humanists are valuable and needed beyond the academy. But I think that you will see a lot of connections, and we've also asked her to explicitly, kind of shift focus to those kinds of careers. And I think that you will really, obviously, you'll see the enormous benefit of what she has to say, and I'm really excited to let her introduce herself and to tell us a little bit more about her thinking on these issues. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to Tricia.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here and for taking time. I know it's summer and you have a lot of things that you can do and maybe you want to do. I hope our time together will be really productive. I'm very thankful to Maureen who asked me a question that I hadn't really considered when I planned this project, diversity and tenure, but it's actually been one of the more intellectually challenging questions I've engaged with since the book was published. It's also kept me up at night. I mean, it's a big question, like how do the best practices of diversity inclusion that I thought about and that the contributors to the volume thought about in thinking about tenure, what can thinking about that help us do as we consider graduate education and careers in the academy, outside of the academy, and careers that are maybe rooted in our doctoral work, but don't necessarily take us on the tenure path. And the more I thought about it, the more I liked that model. As I said to Maureen the other day, you know, we use the term alt-ac to talk about people who don't go on the tenure track, but given the market reality, I think that the alt-ac is really probably the tenure track, right? I know that when I was starting research on the book, it was 70% of faculty were contingent in some way, shape, or form, even if that contingency just meant that they were postdoctoral fellows or tenure track fellows. I was also hyper aware suddenly of the privilege that comes with being a tenured associate professor who can ask these questions in a theoretical way and think about them philosophically. And so I really do hope that when I finish talking that you'll help me see areas where I might miss the mark. It's been a long time since I was in graduate school, and where we can expand my thinking. So in some ways this is a thought experiment, and it's based on my research, and maybe you can, oh, just a quick note, I'm sorry, I'm looking at two screens at once. If you feel like tweeting the talk, my comments, you can. Everywhere you see that little icon from my book, those are passages that I took directly from the book, mostly from interviews and people's essays, sometimes from work that's quoted in the book. But my comments today, my thinking today is rooted in three things. One is the research I did for Written Unwritten. One is what I'm seeing in the public discourse. And one is my own experience and concerns. And this may be, my comments may be a little more personal than they normally would be if I'm talking about the book, just because I think this is a really interesting time for anybody engaged in the humanities ecosystem, and I mean that in its broadest sense, to think about what work we're doing and what that work can do. So Maureen, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So when I talk about the research for Written Unwritten, it's a book that focuses on a variety of fields, mostly in the humanities, but also in the social sciences. When I conceived of the project, it really was it was originally called Written Unwritten Diversity in the Humanities. I'm an English professor, and happily so. I'm a specialist in 19th century British lit, particularly the early part of the period. I work in the history of the novel. I mostly have been writing about gender and genre and how we talk about the body, particularly the body in crisis. And so in many ways, I'm a very, very traditional academic. The non-traditional parts of me are a byproduct of having been a woman of color in the academy who had to make a transition that I'll talk a little bit about when we talk about the environment that graduate students of color often face. So I'd also like you to see, just you can go to the next slide, Maureen. These are the institutions that are discussed in some way, shape, or form in the book. I just think it's really important when we consider these issues of diversity and inclusion that we not fool ourselves into thinking that these are problems in certain institutions and certain parts of the country. I can tell you from experience that graduate students of color at Columbia face racist, sexist obstacles in the same way, and in some ways in more complicated ways than graduate students of color in the South, just to use that term advisedly. So the other thing, I tend to be bold and I'm prescriptive, and so I hope that in making these observations that they'll be seen as the springboard for dialogue. You can go to the next screen. And so in thinking about this question that Maureen and I talked about, I was thinking about two different kinds of ecosystems, the diversity and inclusion ecosystem and the humanities ecosystem, and how thinking about the first can help us be more productive in understanding the work of the second, of the humanities ecosystem, and particularly as a way to prepare graduate students for a world that takes them out of the tenure track, which in certain ways I think can be intellectually limiting because you do your dissertation you complete your dissertation, and you get on the tenure track, and whether you have to publish 1 article, 5 articles, or write a book, you end up focusing rather narrowly on the work that you did as a graduate student. Outside of that traditional ecosystem, I think there are really interesting things to think about and interesting ways to apply the work. And so I'll talk about them in order: the diversity and inclusion ecosystem and the humanities ecosystem. And when I get to social media, this is when I'll talk a little bit more about the trajectory of my own career and what I was thinking about and what I'm thinking about. So you can just go to environment. One of the things I often say is when we talk about microaggressions and we talk about the challenges graduate students of color face, or people of color in the academy face. I'm going to fall into the faculty of color line sentence, just forgive me for that. But when we talk about that, I think we tend to focus really on hurt feelings or people not feeling included in ways that are about like sitting at the same lunch table. And the problem is that an academy that doesn't include or doesn't make space for inclusion is intellectually counterproductive, and it's unproductive, and it's intellectually limiting. And so I think it's so important to understand that when we understand the challenges that graduate students of color face, that we understand it in 3 ways. One of them is how we think about the environment. One is how we talk about the research that graduate students of color might take up or are more likely to take up. And another is how we think about a career path that can work in myriad ways. There are lots of examples of graduate students of color talking about their experiences. I chose this one in particular. Tracy McMillan Cottom wrote this in response to a moment in the Chronicle of Higher Education when they'd done an article on they published an article, a profile of 3 graduate students at Northwestern who were engaged in Black Studies projects. And one of their columnists then wrote a excoriation, or tried to write an excoriation of the field, and used them precisely to dismantle the field. In other words, she didn't pick on the books or articles or organizations that take up Black Studies. She chose 3 graduate students. And in an essay, in thinking about it, Tracy McMillan Cottom really articulates so clearly what's at stake and what often happens and what graduate students of color face, even as they're at the early stages of their career. I'd add to that. Oh, the next slide. I would add to that there are other assumptions laid on them that I think limits how they're able to do work in the academy. That people overestimate their job mobility. So often the assumption is that, if you're a person of color in the academy, you got there because the bar was lowered or as a byproduct of white liberal guilt, and that when you're done, you're just going to, have dozens of job offers and just steal all the jobs from well-deserving people, and those well-deserving people are always imagined as white and male. That's not true. That's just not true. And the other thing that is missing from that assumption is that even if there are job offers, people of color aren't comfortable in every part of the country. And so as one woman I interviewed for Written Unwritten explained to me, she got an amazing job at a college that was in the middle of nowhere. And so she was forced into a very small community of her colleagues. And in the larger community, she was the only Black woman, and there are myriad problems attached to that. So the idea, that you can go anywhere and that you will take any job, and as a result of that, people underestimate the mentorship needs. If your only way of thinking about graduate education for people of color is that they're going to swan into tenure track jobs, then it can be an issue in helping them think about other things that they might be better suited for, that they may find as a better use of their time and their research, and also how they can plan a career. Everything from how letters are written to opportunities that you might make them aware of can be shaped by overestimating the job mobility, the presumption of incompetence or being underprepared, or reading general questions as a sign of unpreparedness, as opposed to the fact that there are kind of Byzantine, mysterious processes in the academy that a lot of people don't know, including people of color. You can move to the next slide. There are also the challenges that come, and I talk about Black people a lot. It's sort of the default in thinking about this, and I'm actually a little testy about the term people of color. But the assumption that everyone has the same experience, right? When we talk about people of color, it's like we flatten out the different challenges that they face. And in thinking, if you're here for this conversation, you probably already know this. I think the challenge then becomes, and you can go on to the next slide. I think the challenge then becomes, how do we approach this issue? And one of the challenges that I'm seeing and hearing is that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we tend to see it only in relationship to underrepresented minorities, kind of like a club for people of color so that they can feel good and sort of feel included in ways that don't necessarily make clear the value of diversity to the entire humanities ecosystem. And that's one of the fourth one, the fourth moment here. It sort of distorts the goals of diversity, inclusion, and inclusion. In my mind, and it was one of the biggest takeaways from the book, is that there is a intellectual lifeblood that diversity and inclusion feeds into that expands the impact of institutions. It expands the way we approach teaching, how we publish, where we publish, and how we think about our work. And I think that one of the biggest challenges is that people think it's only beneficial to a small group, and if you have limited resources, and by resources I don't just mean money, if you have limited time, energy, focus, you're thinking, what can I do for the most, right? How can I help the most people, as opposed to focusing on the few? That gets exacerbated by the fact that there are so few people of color in faculty positions that it can seem as if their experiences are anomalies. You can juxtapose that against the way that people always assume that their campuses are more diverse than they actually are. And sometimes it's a matter of focusing on the student population. Sometimes it's just really not seeing what's absent, and so not understanding that there's a problem to consider. I'm not giving a lot of advice about helping graduate students of color, but I do think it's important for graduate students of color, and I think for this group in particular, when I actually spend a lot of time on social media, and I follow a lot of people who have not followed the tenure track path, and I see a trajectory to those conversations, and one is feeling marginalized. And I think that what this grant has offered and what you all are engaged in is this understanding that on the margins is a place of possibility, right? Is a place where reimagining becomes in and of itself its own intellectual process and its own opportunity to think about ways to impact the larger culture. I have a slide on this later, but I'll say it now and point to it again. I think the danger for those of us who uncritically engage in the tenure track model is that if there are fewer and fewer tenure track jobs, and we make those the ideal, we are limiting the impact of how the humanities can change the world. I think that it's important that people study what matters to them. They have to feel passionate about it, and it may be a small part, or the sort of the notion of expertise, where if you're me, for example, I focus on about 30 years of British Lit, particularly focused on the novel, even though I think about poetry as well. To think about that only as work that I do for other tenure track faculty or tenure line faculty, to think of it only as for the peers in my field, doesn't seem the best use of my intellectual energy or time. And so in some ways, even though I understand that there are there's just sort of huge material and professional risks in sort of being outside of the tenure track model, I think that it's also this really productive space. I'm going to talk about diversity in research, which I think we don't talk about so much. I think so much, and you can go to the next slide, Maureen, if you haven't already. This idea that when we talk about diversity, we're talking about people's experience in classroom spaces, in the hallways, in one-on-one situations. What I'd like to propose here is that we have to rethink what we value in the research agendas that we help graduate students develop and implement. And I put the date on this because this is Annette Kolodny's 1980 essay, because I think in some ways these questions are not new, that every generation of scholars has to answer it for themselves, and every generation of thinkers have to answer it for themselves. And it's so easy when you're out of grad school and you've made it through the tenure process and you're producing the work that you were trained to produce. And then if you're teaching graduate students or you're running a graduate program, you want quote unquote new and innovative scholarship, but we tend to want it to fit neatly into the existing conversation, right? There's this idea that your work is supposed to make an intervention, and that suggests that there's already a conversation happening. That can limit new conversations. It can limit new lines of inquiry. And when Annette Kolodny wrote this in the 80s, she has a moment in here where she argues that the point isn't that we stop reading Hamlet, but that in reading Hamlet, we also pay attention to Ophelia. And I would argue that in our research that we ask graduate students to take on, that they even move beyond Hamlet. We don't have to let Hamlet go, but we have to understand that we're focusing on a few as opposed to the many. I work with underread fiction, for example, and the first thing I discovered when I started reading novels that were not Jane Austen and not Mary Shelley and not the Brontes is that there was a vibrant conversation about race happening between 1790 and 1830. If you're only focusing on canonical text by canonical authors, you're actually, and you're like me and you're interested in the history of the novel, I discovered I was actually missing the conversation that citizens in early 19th century England were having. I'm going to make the claim that if you have a research agenda that doesn't take these questions, we dismiss them by calling them identity politics or identity questions, that your work is actually not as deep as it needs to be. I would even go so far as to call it superficial. This question is raised beautifully, and I can send the, you can go to the next screen if you have it. I can send the link to the YouTube of the panel. And it's what I want to focus on is the epigraph that's included on the front page. I'm not very interested in that stuff. The Shakespeare Association of America has embarked on a 3-year project to examine its membership and how its practices might in benign and malignant ways be limiting the inclusion of its membership and limiting the impact of its work. You should listen to Arthur Little's talk because I can't do it justice in this amount of time, but he makes a couple of points about not being interested in that stuff. He heard that, by the way. He was sitting near 2 white academics, men, middle-aged. They're convenient figures in this conversation, and they were going through the conference book, the conference guide, and one asked the other, are you going to that panel? And he said, I'm not very interested in that stuff. And Little then sort of spins on what that stuff means and how so often when the research agenda of graduate students of color take up issues that are about race or gender or queerness, that the pushback is that it's that stuff, or that as scholars we're supposed to be engaged dispassionately in critical inquiry when, and then he quotes Vasir here, that we got into this work because of passion, right? You're passionate about a text. For me, it was Mary Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I was getting an MA. I got an MA from a regional state university because I was told repeatedly that I didn't have what it took to get a PhD, but I kept being interested in getting a PhD, and so they said, well, go to this regional state university, and if you do well there, then, you know, maybe you can get a PhD. And I read Frankenstein, and I thought, oh my goodness, I can write a whole book about this book. That was not a dispassionate engagement. That was not sort of this aloof critical. It was intense curiosity and love. For me, it's hatred of Victor Frankenstein that's pretty intense. We tend to want this, we tend to argue for this dispassion when the questions of research, the research questions are related to what we want to dismiss as other stuff. And then Little quotes Ayanna Thompson, that talks about if Shakespeare studies here, if we think about race studies more systematically, if we think about, and I would say about gender and queerness and transgender and disability studies, if we think about things and we do it consistently, then diversity can be a more organic process. And the way that that gets built is at the graduate level, so that the people, wherever graduate students go, whether it's the tenure track or out into other fields, that they understand that it's not just that stuff. And so these are the questions that I think you have to ask. What does an intersectional research project look like? And I'm using intersectional in the way that Kim, I was going to say Kim Hall because I know she's here, Kimberly Crenshaw uses the term to think about intersectionality. And these are the kinds of questions that I think graduate students should be thinking about at the very beginning of their research projects, so that they can consider how they want to use their research once they finish the dissertation. Because I think what happens, and this is where I tend to be really hopeful, that when diversity, and I think you can go to the next slide if you haven't, if diversity is fully integral to part of graduate training, these are the benefits. I'm always curious about the second book that academics write. All right, this first book often tends to be the monograph that emerges from the dissertation. It tends to be a little more dutiful. And then it seems a second or third book is when the traditional academic sort of writes the book they always wanted to write and they've been meaning to write. And I think that there's something, can be something almost dutiful about that first book. And I've sometimes wondered if one of the reasons why sometimes those first projects take so long is because we've closed our thinking instead of opening it. Let's move on to thinking about the career element of this, because I know that that's something that I want us to think about when we get to the ecosystem. So you can move. I wanted to take a look at 4 women of color, 3 of whom have PhDs, 1 of whom is a doctoral candidate, and how they have thought about their the research that they undertook and their degrees in, I would say, intellectually creative and innovative ways. I think that it's worth noting Rashida Harrison interviewed Cheryl Wall, who's a Rutgers professor, groundbreaking scholar in Black studies, African American studies, and women's studies. And she didn't have the luxury of the multi-year tenure track job search. She was responsible for the financial well-being of her family. And so being in that contingent space and hoping for the tenure track position wasn't something that she felt like she had. And I'm using this term advisedly, the luxury to pursue. And so after her initial, I think she went on the market 2 years, she started working as a Title IX investigator. And in thinking about it, I think she offers a model for how the research one does as a graduate student can feel important and valuable and necessary to work that isn't necessarily in the model of being a tenure track professor. I think that she might teach at Michigan State from time to time, but this is her work. And of course, the other thing that Rashida found along the way is that outside of the tenure track model, the academy can be a little more diverse. People of color in administrative positions, at some schools there are more of them, and so she found a community, a Black feminist intellectual community that I think she probably would not have encountered if she had followed the tenure line model. You can go to the next slide. Jay Davis, could you just actually, I want to move back and forth between these slides, so if you can go to the next slide, please, Maureen. Yeah. Jay Davis talked about, I asked her, I said, did you know this is what you were going to do, right? So Rashida Harrison sort of did the traditional, she went to graduate school, she went to a couple of conferences, she wrote that, the paper for the edited collection so she could argue that she had a research agenda launch, and then that didn't work out, and so she went this route. Jay Davis, when I asked her about it, said she was always eyeing things outside of the academy. She understood that people assumed that A, she would go into a tenure track position, and that B, she would have an easy time getting a job. But in her mind, and then you can go back to her website, if you would please, to the last slide, but in her mind, she was always imagining work outside of the academy. And I highlight this moment from her website when I do cultural studies, Fanon, Bart, McLuhan, and Zora Neale Hurston. that this was not a letting go of an intellectual tradition. I'm going to say later, or maybe I'll just say it now, I think that one of the biggest obligations that graduate faculty have to their graduate students is to help them understand what it's actually like being tenured faculty. I think that there's a fantasy that you teach your classes and you do your research, and occasionally you show up for a committee meeting or roll your eyes in a faculty meeting, but you really spend your time in the life of the mind. I think, and people push back at me if I'm wrong, I think that happens in June and July and August, and then you're feeling so anxious that you have so much to do that you didn't get done during the year because you were on the curriculum committee, or you were advising students, or there was a search for a dean and you were asked to serve on that search, or you have an external visiting committee coming and you're pulled into that, or all of the myriad ways that faculty governance sort of interrupts or disrupts the work that we do, and while we're required to do it, that doesn't actually count. And I would note, if you look at her website, and I have it there under her name, you'll see that she continues to write, and she writes for multiple audiences. You're as likely to see her in a peer-reviewed journal as you are to see her writing about the problematics of the constant videos of black men being executed that go on a loop whenever there's a new victim, and what that means. And she's applying her cultural studies training in both of those instances. I happen to know Jay Davis quite well, and she's writing a new essay, and she said, well, I haven't written anything like this in 2 years. And I thought, how wonderful that she was doing other things, and then this question came up that she wanted to explore so she could write the essay that she wanted to write outside of the pressure of having to produce. That is part of the tenure line model that I think actually encourages people to be quick as opposed to deep. You can go to the next slide and the next one, right? Dominique is in Canada, and she's also started off thinking about a tenure track job, also could not just let that be her focus. She could not survive. She knew she could not survive on an adjunct faculty. There's a conversation to be had about why women of color, most of whom are single, and so they're the only providers in their homes, cannot be on the contingent track for too long. And then when she finally found the ideal teaching experience, and she thought, oh my gosh, I kind of find this exhausting. And so she's found other work. She's a program manager, and she works in grants and operations at this nonprofit in Toronto. And I was thrilled at the idea that someone whose training roots her, these are the areas that she specializes in, would be assessing grants to this organization. Because the other thing about thinking about the diversity in careers is that what you can have are people who are well trained in the best practices and the best ideals of the humanities in positions of authority and power where they can grant funds and space and the sort of material resources to others so that they can do their own work. You can go to the next. One of the things that Maureen's invitation sort of revealed to me was I hate to call it a tension because it sounds like there is a fight, but there is a kind of productive tension between what we tell graduate students their work is supposed to do and what they might be feeling. Stacey Patton, that was the essay I think Maureen circulated before today, and it came up, if you read it, it came up because after Michael Brown, I felt the same way, by the way, and by this point, I believe that I was an associate professor. I got tenure, and then it took a little while. Tenure and promotion are separate at my institution. But these questions are organic and natural and important, and I think Stacey captures that a lot of people are feeling them. You can go to the next slide. And they feel them in different ways. Ariana Alexander, much like Jade, did not start off thinking that she was going to go, she's not thinking about a tenure track field. She knew very early in her discussion in Written Unwritten, she knew very early on that the tenure track model wasn't for her. And she has a very traditional CV. She was on her way in that way that we think about. She was a Ford Fellow. She'd given a talk at Berks. She's a historian, so that's their major field. Again, she was working in the archives. Her Her dissertation is about the slave markets in the Bronx. They use that term slave markets even though she's covering a time period post-slavery. But her question then became, how can I see my intellectual work manifest itself in real ways? And we might get a little touchy and think, well, our work manifests itself in real ways. But really what she wanted to explore is how could she take her work back to the community that produced her. And she's had different jobs. I talk about this with her in the book, and how she engages in that work is rooted in her research. But she makes a comment that staying in the academy can keep you in a kind of fog, and the hyper focus on doing everything you want to do and sacrificing so much for this mythological tenured life wasn't one that she wanted to explore, and she felt like it was getting in the way of her immediate impact. Yeah, I think we can go on to the next slide. I was thinking about, like, how do you get, and I would love to hear more about this in the discussion, because when I was in graduate school, the only people who came in were really people who were doing the kinds of work that I imagined myself doing. There might have been, what else can you do with a PhD moment, but it wasn't highlighted, right? Oh, could you go back to the?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying. I think I'm going the wrong way. I apologize.
That's okay.
Here, where are we? Here, there.
There. Oh, come on.
Okay.
There you are. Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So I was thinking about when we bring people to campus, when we spend our precious money, our speakers' money to bring people to campus, if we're only bringing in traditional scholars, what we're signaling to our graduate student is that's what matters, that's what's important. And so I try to think of practical things that you can do and think about going forward. And one is bring in PhDs who have successfully pursued other careers. I am not Jade Davis's agent, and I am not Dominique's agent, or Ariana's, or Rashida's. I'm not, I promise. But they can all speak, I think, in really interesting ways about how they did this work and why they did this work and how it feels to not be on the tenure track. And the other thing is, where you put your resources is how you signal what's important. And so if there are opportunities that graduate students have where they can explore things, I think digital pedagogy is, I was seeing online, somebody was saying, I want to do this thing, but I don't get money for that. I only get money if I give a paper at a conference. What that graduate student is being told is that is the work that matters. Even though it's not necessarily going to lead, it's more likely not going to lead to a very narrow ideal. Digital pedagogy, on the other hand, is an open field, and that I think it allows for people to do different kinds of work. And so you have to be really careful about signaling different models of success. Whose news items, what gets celebrated, and where can you send graduate students so that they can explore alternatives, not when they're on the market and stressed and anxious, but as just a kind of embedded in their thinking about their graduate education. And I'll say it again, I really believe that focusing on the tenure track model limits the impact of humanities research, and I think that matters, and I'll talk about this at the end, because I hear a lot of people bemoaning how nobody reads X anymore, nobody cares about A anymore, and our public discourse has sort of just dissolved into rage. And I think, yes, and the people who might be able to have an impact on that are in their ivory towers teaching text in the same way that they've been teaching them, when their students would probably actually like to hear other things about them and to understand other things about what they're thinking, and to understand that the model of critical inquiry can be applied broadly. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Could you go to the next slide? And that gets us to this ocean, I like that, of the humanities ecosystem. Again, you can go to the next slide. I'm thinking of, a lot of people here know Ernest Boyer and know his nets of 1997, but we still are wrestling with it. And we're wrestling with it, I think, now that I've been considering this question in two ways: in how we value the work that tenure faculty do, and that's not really the subject of today, but also what we, again, signal to graduate students is the ideal work and the ideal way to move and do their work. Could you move to the next one? Public scholarship. I think that this is a tricky area, and I would love to hear more about what I see as a kind of anxiety about when to enter or when to write and think about one's research for a broader audience. You can go to the next slide. And this is what I was talking about with the kind of, when I see the kind of tension. I don't want to misrepresent either Houston Baker or E. Francis White, because I was asking them about the tension I saw that Stacey Patton makes really clear. That you have a lot of, particularly I would say, I was hearing this more and more from Black graduate students and seeing more online where Black junior faculty were trying to make an impact on the world outside of their field, right? They all kind of, I think, imagine that they might be the next Michael Eric Dyson, or they might be the next Jelani Cobb, or they might be the next Melissa Harry Paris, like, or Paris Harry. Like, how do you get out of the confines of the academy and still survive and succeed in the academy? And both Francis and Houston would tell us we need to keep our heads down and do that work, and that it needs to be focused. And when she's talking about, I'd asked her, I said, what about these essays that people write for, you know, The Atlantic or Vox? And she said, when it comes to it, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't really register. There really is the coin of the realm. There's not a lot of currency. And I even saw this, and I don't say it as complaint, I even saw this in how my own book was received. There are people at my institution who are only just now paying attention to written and unwritten because I'm doing a workshop with the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is legible, right? I couldn't have asked for more publicity. I was featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Education. I was invited to write an essay for The Atlantic. There was an interview with me in the Los Angeles Review of Books. And it barely, it barely registered with people. But the second Maureen gave me this invitation and I mentioned it to my dean, it was suddenly, you can look at Montclair's, suddenly it's me, you know, Matthew Gibbs, NEH, because there are certain things that the Academy, I'm sorry, let me say that differently. The Academy really only recognizes certain arenas and certain venues for disseminating work, and that's often at odds where a lot of the quote-unquote action is happening. You can go to the next slide. These are the, I think if you're here, you probably know, these are the places where academics tend to write. The conversation cracked me up. I like the tag, academic rigor, journalistic flair. I feel like we're going to live in that world in a minute. But one of the questions we can think about, and I'm almost done, is what is the relationship between doctoral research and the dissemination of that research? There's an anxiety there I'd like to explore. Could you go to the next slide? I think one thing that I discovered in talking to people is that we think of service in different ways in the academy and outside of the academy. And I don't know very many people of color who feel like they just want to do their work in the academy. Even Frances White talked to me about this. She was a provost and she retired as provost at NYU. Associate provost at NYU. And she said, I did what we might call community engagement. I just didn't put it on my CV. That work, the pressure to do that work, the desire, and it's an internal pressure to do that work is there. You can go to the next. And so ideally, this is a question from the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. They offer fellowship to graduate students at the University of Iowa. But the question they ask you, the question they ask you to consider is one that I think all graduate students should be considering as they develop their research agendas and how they think about what they want to do next. You can go on to the next slide. And when the Obermann Center sort of tells its applicants what counts, I really love how diverse this list is, right? I think it's such a great balance of the traditional academic work. They put the list in this order, so you see peer-reviewed is at the top. They have a book series that they've published about public humanities, and Teresa Magnum has asked me to mention that to you. But I also like that it allows for different ways for people to do the work of the humanities. You can go to the next. I'm almost near the end. I want us to think about, I wanted to talk a little bit about social media. It's on the minds of a lot of people, and I think it's still a space where productive things can happen. You can ask me during Q&A why it matters so much to me, but this moment here from Du Bois is one of the reasons why despite the fact that it can be a cesspool of trolling and bad behavior, generally speaking, why I'm there. It's because it's the place where I can actually confront those problems and I can talk about problems where there is no other space. Partly it's because I specialize in 19th century British lit, but partly I think it's because I was trained by the academy to think about what I was supposed to focus on. And I was supposed to be dispassionate. I was supposed to fit in. I was supposed to ask questions that were only within a really narrow box. And I found that, first of all, I did all of that and I still didn't fit in. And I found myself getting really bored. There's a lot of post-tenure ennui that we don't like to talk about. There'll be articles about it here and there. And social media was a way for me to feel reinvigorated because I found that whatever I was talking about, as a humanities specialist, I could bring a certain lens to bear on it and ask specific kinds of questions that other people found interesting. You can go to the next slide. So here's my social media profile. I still publish in peer-reviewed journals. I'm working on a monograph now and another book. But this is where I spend time, and this is where I invest some of my time. I have a pretty modest Twitter following, given I think I joined in like 2007. But, of course, the more followers I get, the more people I can engage with. Could you actually skip to the next slide, and then I can come back to this? So I tend to follow black academics. I'm the only black woman in my department. I'm the only black person in my department, and I have been now for 3 or 4 years. And before that, there was only one other black woman in the department. And so I wanted to have conversations with other black academics, and I found them on social media. I also wanted to be able to be in dialogue with other 18th and 19th century British lit faculty, other kinds of scholars, writers, and journalists. And this is what I tweet about, and this is what I blog about. And in the lower corner, I think it's on the right-hand side of your screen, those are pieces that I've written or have featured me. And if you go to the next slide, I can talk about it. And it's all, it all happened before that. It all happened, most of that happened before that book came out. In other words, being on social media kind of inverted the path to my research having an impact. I did not have to wait for the book to be out to write and think and talk about diversity in higher education. The list here, all of this happened, and you can go now back to the page where the blog, yeah. All of this happened because I was blogging in 2 spaces. The space on the left is a blog where I blog about my teaching and my research and my writing, and then the space on the right is where I was blogging about the project before it was published, before I even had a publisher. When I went up, when my proposal was being circulated, one of the things I was told was that my social media presence really helped. They knew that I had an audience and I'd be able to reach them. To the top right, it says May's top mention, Paula Krebs. I'm on Twitter, and in my mentions, this very nice white lady said this nice thing about my book, and I thought, oh, that's very nice. It was the top mention. I don't do networking. I was telling Maureen, reminds me that I say this. I don't believe in it because I don't know how to engage with people with intention in that way. I'm curious about some people, and I like them, or I want to know them better, or I don't. And so I don't network, but I do have a community, and I do have a network. And I was so tickled when just 2 days ago there was an announcement that Paula Krebs is the new executive director of the MLA. I didn't know that when she wrote that, and so it's kind of nice, that she read the book and that she talked to other people about it. And I think that's one of the things I like about social media, the kind of you just bump into and stumble into conversations with other people, and your work can go places that you don't necessarily take it. You think it's going to go. And so you can go to the final. I'm going to end so we can have time to talk, and thinking about maybe the best moment where I feel like my own humanities ecosystem was the most productive. And go back to this idea that when I'm not really into that stuff, right? So no one's really into that stuff. So many academics are not into it. And then Michael Brown happened. And I found myself in this kind of lonely space. I've been reading about it. I followed it obsessively. And very few people in my department were talking about it. My co-teacher was one of the few people who was talking about it. And it took us about, let's see, maybe a year to come up with an event. And what I discovered as we were planning an event for our community around this issue of Ferguson and police violence, we wanted to put together a reader so that the faculty who attended or the students who attended would have context. And that's what garnered the attention after I tweeted about it like 6 or 7 months later. And I was kind of mindful when people were writing to me to ask for this reader that they didn't really know how to engage with this stuff, right? It's not that they didn't care. Some of them, didn't. But it's not that people didn't care about Michael Brown. It's not that academics didn't want to talk about it with their students. It's that they had no training for it, and they felt that they needed a specific kind of training that was missing. And I was astonished by how many requests I got for the reader long after the event. The event was in January. I tweeted about it 9 months later because, of course, the problem hasn't even gone away or lessened. And I was struck over and over again by how many humanities professors and some social scientists were saying, I need this because I don't have the materials that my students need. And I thought, we're not experts. I say this elsewhere in the Atlantic. I'm not an expert, and I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a historian. Everything I contributed to the reader, there were 3 of us and we all made contributions, that was stuff I just read on social media because I wanted to keep up and I wanted to know. And I didn't present myself as an expert on the subject to my students. I did present myself as an expert of what it means to be critically engaged in the world. So I think that may be Maureen signaling my time, but I think that there's a lot to be said about how, the possibilities, right? That was the moment for me when I could see social media come together. It wasn't about promoting my research. It wasn't about promoting even written and unwritten. It wasn't about promoting anything. It really was, however, about contributing to a national conversation about a subject of deep importance. And I was struck after Trump was elected by how many people who didn't quote unquote care about that stuff were horrified about the result of the election. And if you care about that stuff, then you can see the trajectory that there's actually a link between the extrajudicial killings and a culture that would produce and elect Donald Trump as president. And so I think the humanities work can get us to, not resolving it, but at least making an impact on how we can consider how we can change the world. I hate to say that. It sounds like such a cliche. But really, how we can help people understand how we got here, right? That's maybe not the work that everyone wants to do, but it is definitely the work that everybody wants done. And so I think it behooves us to be a part of it as much as possible. So just quickly, and maybe I can even say it at the end, there's a discount code if you want the book. Could you put the slide forward? Yeah, if you want the book. And if you could just put the slide at the end with the thank yous, because everybody who contributed to the book. So that's it. Thank you for being, I think I went a little longer than I wanted, but thank you for being so, I was going to say so attentive. I don't know. It's a webinar, but thank you for being here. And I think people stayed, so I think we can talk now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tricia. And I want to just remind everyone that if you have anything to say throughout our discussion, I'll ask you to either raise your hand or to type in your question or comment in the comment field. And I apologize for all of the back and forth with the slides. I was having a little of my own trigger finger, I guess. That it was never an indication that you were going too quickly or too slowly. It was just me not understanding how computers work. So first, Amy, I don't know if you, well, I'm going to leave your announcement till the end. But so if anybody has any questions for Tricia, I know that Katya, are you still on the line? Because I know you had something to ask. If you're there, you are unmuted. Okay, I think Katya had to go, but she wanted to ask you, Tricia, and I think you know Katya is our program officer at NEH. She wanted to know whether so there is this situation where outside of the academy, the humanities itself as an enterprise is perceived as primarily white. And she mentioned the hashtag. I don't know if this is an existing hashtag or one she just made up, but hashtag humanities so white. She said, this is a reality in the world out there. It's because of the word humanities and its history as a hegemonic area of study, not because of lived experience. But she wondered whether you might have any thoughts about that or comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that people perceive it that way because it's seen as work. It's seen as activity. I'm not even calling it activities that only privileged people engage in, right? Even for myself, when I started off, I got an English degree because I wanted to be a journalist. I went to college to be something, right? I love to read and I love to talk about my reading, but my parents sent me, neither of my parents went to college. And so they told me, you go to college and you get a degree and you have to be something so that you can get a job. And I think that when people hear the humanities, they think arts and humanities, and they don't think of those things as essential. They think of them as secondary. And if it's something that can be considered a luxury activity, then it's always going to be assigned, or the assumption is always going to be that only white people have the time and luxury to engage with it. I think that she's absolutely right, that humanities done right is actually incredibly diverse, but I think it is the fault of graduate education that ignored traditions that everybody else was paying attention to. And here, I'll talk again about my own research. You know, I read the same canonical authors in high school, in college, and in graduate school. And it wasn't until I was getting my PhD and I had to think about my own research project and I started reading these books that were widely read and well respected during their own time to understand the degree to which your average 19th century British citizen was thinking about race, because they were thinking about the slave trade and the abolition of slavery all the time. It was the question of the moment. And I managed to get all the way to my doctoral program without anybody ever mentioning that to me even once. And everyone who taught me would have considered themselves progressive and they would want the humanities to matter to everyone. But we talk about it and value it and teach it in such a way that we mute and we ignore the conversations, and I'm saying conversations because I'm a lit person, that happen there because we focus on whiteness. We focus on it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just share my own experience as I'm also in English, and I didn't have my area is 19th century American literature, and throughout my undergraduate career, I really didn't have any exposure to writing about or literature of the Black experience in America until I took an African American literature course my senior year, and I could have very easily missed that. And then I just remember thinking, as a student sitting in the classroom, this is really important. And I was really angry that no one had ever talked to me or taught me about these issues and these experiences in this kind of more nuanced and in-depth way. And I have never really understood.
Well, and also, I mean, just to stay with the English, you know, the English model for a second, I'm always, when I tell my students in my theory class, we talk about literary canons, and I said, go look and see what courses are required and look what courses you get to choose to take. Right?
Yeah.
And if you require certain courses and tell students that other courses are electives,
yeah, exactly.
that tells them, you know, that shapes the choices that they make because they have to be practical. I remember meeting a new PhD at a conference, and she realized that all the African American lit courses at this one English department were electives. All the required courses were, they were British, right? English as a whole tends to privilege Britain more than American lit, and they were all, you know, so you require Chaucer, you require Milton, you require Shakespeare, you probably don't require Morrison, right, or you don't require Hurston, and that tells students, oh, I have to read my Shakespeare. I do not have to. I can live a life without reading Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
That's not true, but people can get through college and think that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, we could talk about English
Yeah.
canonical questions all day, but I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you about if maybe your research or your experience has left you with any ideas about best practices that might be adopted by NextGen project directors or project teams thinking about how to shape professional development for doctoral students with an eye toward the public humanities, embracing this ethos of diverse careers while also ensuring that the diverse lived experiences and research interests of their students are incorporated into that vision.
Yeah, I think partly we have to think outside of the academy. I was kind of mindful in selecting the people I talked about. I wanted to make sure, it's one of the reasons I included Dominique's story, is because she is not academy adjacent, right? I think that understanding, I think one of the best practices is, and I think you're starting this with the collection of the trajectory of where people go after they finish, is to have people come back and talk about work that takes them, I would say, as far away from the academy as possible. Because I think the impact and the ideas are disseminated differently, even if you are not a tenure track faculty, but you're still in the academic ethos. You're still performing a certain model of of humanities discourse. So I think partly it is using the work of people and having them come in and say, okay, this is how I did it, and here's the question. I didn't have time to talk about, Jade said it's really important for graduate students to understand, Jade Davis, how the research that they conduct actually is useful outside of their discipline. And I think those are the kinds of conversations that this group can be having. I look at something like the National Humanities Center and their America in Class school program. I'm just full disclosure, I'm part of it this year, where they're pairing, they've put 10 teams together, one university professor and one secondary education professor, and we're going to develop the idea of best practices. How do you teach, or what does it mean to read literature well? What does it mean to understand history? What does it mean to engage with philosophy? And those kind of partnerships should happen more and more, so that, because I think we tend to pull ourselves out of the K through 12 model, and we think the only way to engage in K through 12 is whether as teachers. When I think if you have these partnerships and you build them along the way, that graduate education can keep that in mind and not make that something that's completely separate, right? The Obermann Center has K through 16, and this goes back to what you were telling me about the community college, the relationships between community colleges. I feel like there's a lot of space there.
Thanks. Okay, we have a question from Katina Rogers at CUNY.
Hi, Katina.
Go ahead, Katina.
Great. Hi, thank you so much. Tricia, thanks so much for that talk, and Maureen, thanks very much for organizing it. I've learned so much from this. Tricia, I was wondering, you spoke a lot about research and public engagement and obviously about graduate programs. I'd love to also hear a little bit more about your pedagogical approach, maybe in the undergraduate classroom. I'm curious about ways that your teaching addresses matters of diversity and inclusion and the need for mentorship, not only through the content that you're teaching, but also if there are ways that you actively work on structuring your classroom differently or structuring your approach to teaching differently with these kinds of things in mind.
Yeah, that's a good question. As someone who specializes in 19th century lit for so long, thinking about diversity was really just me being there talking about Jane Austen, like that, sort of counted. But I had a class, and I'm chuckling as I tell the story because I remember I was one of the faculty members who didn't think it was a good idea. But we offer a course that's called Writing for the Major. And the way it's structured is that the professor can take up any question or issue or talk about a theme that's of interest to them. And I realized that I was sort of doing this weird segregation, and I'm using that term really carefully, where I kept saying I wanted to write about the history of the novel. I was writing about Mary Shelley and chronology and doing all of this, and I wasn't taking up the question of race. And so I asked myself, what would happen if you designed a classroom that took up the question of race in the 19th century? And I designed a class on abolitionist British literature. And the question, and my students took me, and partly this is how, you know, there's a way in which I break down that wall between the 19th and the 21st century. But I teach, I should say quickly, I teach at a very diverse institution at the level of student population. I think, for example, I taught this British abolitionist lit class just this semester, and I would say it was maybe out of 19 students, I would say 8 of them were students of color. But not just students of color brought up these questions, but they think about race in the 21st century way. And the work of getting them to understand how race was talked about in the early 19th century, to consider how the abolitionist movement worked, the different strategies the abolitionists had to take, the different obstacles, it resonated very quickly for them that we were seeing patterns. And then, because I often teach education majors, I actually allow one of their projects can be about developing a lesson plan. Right? They have to write an essay explaining it, but I ask them from the very beginning of the semester not to think of themselves as students, but to think about themselves as future teachers. And there's a lot of back and forth. I'm always asking them, you know, okay, so we just discussed this poem. What do you feel you need? How might I have taught it differently? My class this semester was very irritated with me, and they said I just need to completely restructure the calendar in ways that make more sense for students. And so that class is a dialogue where I'm kind of modeling what it means to engage with students. I mean, I'm the professor. There's no way it's not top down, but not to treat them like empty vessels that I fill up. And I started thinking about how I was assigning writing to my students, because I realized I was perpetuating this idea, and several of my colleagues and I are thinking about this. We kept assigning the kinds of essays that we wrote, which were the kind of essays that you write when you're thinking of going to graduate school. And so I taught, for example, a Jane Austen seminar one year, and I told the students they had to design it, and I asked them to design projects that required research, analysis, and interpretation, but it didn't have to necessarily produce writing in the way that they had considered it, unless that was something they wanted to do. Some of the students chose that. It's because what they're most comfortable with, but other students knew that they wanted, for example, to be in fields where they were sort of, we tell English majors all the time, you can do anything. And, you know, some of them wanted to work on their public speaking skills. I had one student, and she decided that her project all year was going to be kind of like our human footnote person. So every time she would read ahead of us, basically, and say, oh, or come to class and say, oh, these are the 5 or 6 things that I think you should know. Normally I would do that, right? But she was paying attention as well. And I think that asking students along the way to think about the work that they're doing and what's working for them, and not working for them like they don't want to do the work, but what actually fits into the questions they thought they were going to ask or the work they thought they were going to do, that in itself is a diverse practice, and it allows a broad range of students to engage. And when it comes to mentorship, I think that those relationships start in the classroom, right? If I see students in a class and I see them, whether they're struggling or soaring, I'm really careful to let them know that we have a relationship outside of the classroom. I'm really, really big on saying, hey, come see me, or sending students things I think they might want to read. And somehow I think a professor saying, I thought of you and I thought you might like this, or saying, hey, I'm very big on mentioning things and then not sending them out to class, and then having students write me to see if they want it. And then when they write me, I send them more things. That kind of builds this idea that I'm a resource in as much as I'm their professor. So I think that touches on some of the questions.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. And I just want to acknowledge that Katina is the person who connected me and Tricia. So she deserves a lot of credit for today's webinar. So we have another question from Amanda Swing. Amanda, you're at UC, one of the UCs, right? I'm blanking now on where exactly Amanda's from, but she has a question about how to talk to PhD students. She says, we have a lot of PhD students who are first generation college. There seems to be a perception on their part that if they engage in conversations about multiple career paths, it implies that they won't be good enough to get a tenure track job, or that they think that they're projecting something less than the image that they should be projecting to their
I like a lack of
colleagues.
scholarly seriousness, right?
Right, exactly. So do you have any advice on how to talk about multiple career paths that honors how hard these students work to get to grad school, but also engages the reality of post-PhD work, both the academic job market and what they themselves might enjoy as a career? And she's from UC Irvine. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, and I should, their concern is very real, right? I mean, we're all human. We gravitate to the people who are like us. So in graduate school, the dissertation advisor who's got 10 advisees is going to gravitate towards those probably most whose careers are going to look most like her own. Mm-hmm. And so I think their anxiety is perfectly justified. And I think as a whole, this is something where, what I mentioned earlier, what you give your resources to sort of signals that. I think there has to be a conversation about other things one does with a PhD, and it shouldn't happen that students attend those talks as they are thinking about the job market.
Right.
I think you have to have those conversations a lot earlier. And I think it has to be okay for students to get a PhD and articulate that they're getting a PhD knowing that they're not going to go take a tenure track job. Mm-hmm. Right? I think sometimes, how do I say this? I think that sometimes graduate students understand better than graduate faculty that there are multiple things that they can do. But we ask them to perform in a very narrow way. The dissertation performs a very specific kind, and I want to be really clear, not of intellectual work, right, but of intellectual product. The dissertation that is the sort of mini product that's going to turn into a book. I know that there are graduate programs that are thinking about different cumulative projects, and I want to be really clear. I think the kind of research and work and focus and persistence and discipline that produces a dissertation can't be replaced, right? But the idea that there's only one way to produce that work over the course of a graduate career kind of sets people up to think that that's the only thing that's really important. And maybe one way to answer that is to, and American Studies gives us this model in theory, right? One of the things I wanted to say is that I was always so surprised at how people think of diversity as lowering the bar, because I think to be a part of a diverse community requires intellectual rigor, because you have to engage with different kinds of projects. For example, in graduate school, I immediately joined our graduate students of color community, and by necessity, it was interdisciplinary. And so when we talked about our work, I was talking to people from across the university campus about their work, and they were always doing different things. They weren't all going into the tenure track models. So I think facilitating those conversations interdisciplinarily is part of it. But even, and I'm sorry the slideshow is not up, that list of what the Obermann Center counts as making let's see if we can get there. That'd be really great.
Is that here it is?
Yeah, I think those kinds of projects should be the kinds of projects that students are encouraged to consider before they get to the stage of writing the dissertation, when the stakes are really high, and they understand that the community that they're in really, really celebrates just basically one or two ways of being. I think you either get to be a university professor or you're a university administrator. You run a writing center or some sort of programmer. But if you look at this list, it lets people do all kinds of work that's rooted and based in the humanities. And give them money, and give them money to explore that.
Yeah.
Right, our doctoral, I don't know if I'm right about this, but I remember the doctoral fellowships were really given to people who were perceived as going to, into the tenure track, and who were going to be considered quote unquote stars, And the quote-unquote stars were people who were reproducing a very sort of exclusionary scholarly model.
Yeah, I mean, these are all issues that all of the NextGen programs have been wrestling with all year, and just trying to cultivate conversations on their campuses with all kinds of different stakeholder groups and across different disciplines, and trying to stimulate thinking about and action on how to create these connections for students, how to create spaces for them to engage in these kinds of conversations themselves, and also to build in the supports and the mentorship supports that you kind of mentioned earlier for allowing them opportunities not only to talk about their career earlier on in their graduate school experience, but also to feel supported when they do express interest in pursuing careers beyond the academy.
I also want to just go back briefly to what Katina and mentoring students. I make it a point to talk to students early that I mostly teach English majors, and often they're sophomores. And they don't even have to be the best students in the class. They just have to be the students who I see who are engaged. And I just invite them to come talk to me, right? Say, come talk to me about, what you're interested in. And even if, with shy students, it can be a little trickier. I might leave a note on an essay. And I don't do it, I couldn't do it with all of my students. I have a 3-3 teaching load. But I really think, I teach a lot of first-generation college students, and I try to help them understand that, A, they have a talent for something, and then I'm there to help them figure out what to do with that talent. One of the things I'm, working on is reconsidering sort of internship models, because I think you have to have some way to have students show and potential employers that they, that they can get a job. And I really, I don't focus so much on the students who I think are going to go to grad school, even though I see them and I say there are these programs and think about it like this. I really try to make sure that I'm paying attention to all of the ways that my students are talented, so that I can have them start thinking of their talents in ways that will help them, not just do well in school, but think about what they can do afterwards.
Yeah, I've just read an article by Julie Passelt, and she was talking about how really contextualizing individual experiences for graduate students is really important. So, if they encounter maybe one person or one really difficult failure or one setback, it's really important to have those faculty voices behind them saying, look, this is just one setback. You are bigger than this. Your experience will extend beyond this moment, and this, let's put this in perspective. And I think that's one of the most important things that faculty can do. And it's pretty simple, but it's often so overlooked, right?
Yeah.
And so we have a question from Carol Giannetti. She wants to know, Tricia, do you incorporate activities that develop skills of public scholarship or social media into your graduate curriculum or graduate courses themselves? How do you make the case for these type of skills with your colleagues and with students who say they're only interested in tenure-track careers? Have you considered reifying these skills as program learning outcomes? And if so, how was this received by your colleagues?
Well, our university, my department doesn't have a doctoral program. We offer the terminal MA.
Okay.
And so, so I think I should have made that clear. I will say that we have a public writing minor at our school at the undergraduate level. I think they're going to build a graduate program around that. But in my own teaching, I've had students who come to me and said, for example, in this Austin seminar, I had a student who said, I want to be a blogger. Can I write blogs about what we're reading in class? And I let her do it because it meant that she was thinking not of me as an audience, but as other people. Like, how do you talk about Jane Austen? How do you talk about Jane Austen? And one of the things she learned, for example, is that everybody has an opinion about Jane Austen. I think it would have just been her writing papers for me. That would have been it. I don't think you can tell a student, I don't think you can tell a student who's focused on getting a tenure track job that they can't focus on getting a tenure track job. So to answer that question, right, if someone thinks that that's what they really want to do and that that's what they're really going to get, I think the best thing you can do is make sure that their graduate education spotlights other ways to do that work. I don't know if I have an answer to the public engagement, where that training comes from. I think that's why I put that question, because I was thinking about, some graduate work lends itself to discussion in the public arena, but I don't know that I have an answer. I guess I would go back and say, I would want to know what would the resistance be from the graduate faculty at her institution, right? Like, that would be something I wish we could just talk with one another for a minute, or maybe she can text, like, what is the resistance that she's encountering, and what is it that people really fear is going to happen? Because I do think that so much of resistance comes from a couple of places. One, not understanding or not wanting to understand something new. I can't tell you how many times I've proposed something and people said, what problem are you fixing? Right. Yeah, most faculty, most academics don't want to do something new just for the sake of doing something new, unless a dean is going to give them money to do it. But really, it's like, what problem are you fixing? And I don't think the answer can be that there are no jobs, because I think that a lot of people just remain in denial about that. And so I think being able to answer that question, and then I think actually pointing to models that are being done. The University of Massachusetts at Amherst has, I think it's called the, let me see if I can find it here. It's called the Public Policy Center. And I'm going to tell you I like how it's a public engagement project, bringing research to the public. It's focused heavily on the social sciences, and what I'm seeing missing in the public engagement project like this, or the op-ed project where people are trained, right, about how to write opinion pieces and how to participate in public discourse. I think those sorts of things can be useful, but I think in the humanities, we're sometimes limited by our imagination or how we see ourselves, and I think we tend to not think as broadly maybe as we need to. I mean, I don't want to just do the default to digital humanities because it's not my field, and I know it's a rich and complex area, and people kind of call everything digital humanities when that's not the case. But I think that the questions that I understand digital humanities to be asking are the kinds of questions that I think humanities departments should be thinking about and having their graduate students think about in their work.
Right. Yeah.
I just want to say I feel like that's not a really full answer, because that's a really, really rich, complicated question. So I'd love to hear if other people have a response to that.
Yeah, I was gonna bounce it back to the group, but before I do that, first of all, I wanted to mention that Carol's at UCSB. I should have said that, but that it occurred to me that some of the skills you're talking about, public engagement, digital humanities, are useful for faculty as well, right? It's not so there may be a sort of false dichotomy or false way of thinking about a student who says they want a tenure track career, that's what they're going to do, that's what they're going to pursue, and saying, well, you can't do that, you have to learn about the digital humanities. That doesn't have to be the conversation. You can frame it differently. You could say, great, what would be really helpful to you?
Here's the thing. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Here's the thing. I would say to that graduate student, what do you think a tenure-line faculty, a tenure track, what do you think that work is like? Right. How do they imagine? Because I do feel like so many, and this happened to me even as I was probably one of the last generation of graduate students where you could get a job without having published 6 essays. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But I don't know that graduate students really understand 2 things, that what they want from a tenure track job, they can get in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And that might be where we have to do the legwork and to show them that. And I would ask a student that was persistent about that, do they really know the thing that they want? And that's not saying, I know you desire a tenure track job, but do you really know what that work is like? Because I left graduate school thinking I got it, right? I went to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I was in the union, so I knew that worked. I got to sit in on, committees, and so I thought, oh, I understand how that works. Like, I really thought I understood everything I needed to know being a tenure line faculty member. And I think I fell flat on my face within the first week in my job because I did not understand how complex that, and I love that you make me think about ecosystems. The ecosystem of the tenure life is. I did not understand its nuances. I didn't understand its drains. I didn't understand, and I did not have to have a book for tenure. I had a short tenure clock, and I teach, like I said, mostly English majors, but I had a 3-3 teaching load. I did not, for example, understand what it meant to teach English majors as opposed to teaching first-year writing students who tend to take your class and go on and do other things. What was it to be a professor in a community of students? I don't know that they always know, and I think if they knew more, they might not romanticize it so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just really think that, I really do, I could be wrong, I just think they romanticize it. I think they think June and July is the whole year.
Yeah. So, Carol, did you have something else you wanted to add here? I'm unmuting you if you would like to say something. No? Okay. Well, then I might just ask everybody on the line to kind of respond to Carol's question. How many of you have talked about including these types of public engagement skills in doctoral learning outcomes? One looks like Kansas might have had this conversation. Looks like that's it. So that's really interesting. I mean, another question would be whether doctoral learning outcomes are even part of your conversations. So the question was, how many of you have talked about including public engagement skills in your doctoral learning outcomes? Okay, so it looks like two people, 2 hands. Graduate school, so CUNY Graduate Center and Duke have also been having these conversations, it looks like. I'm gonna lower your hands if you had an actual question or comment, CUNY Graduate Center or Duke. You should raise your hand again. Nicole says this is one point of discussion in our NEH planning grant, and we held a series of public communication workshops in spring semester for our graduate students. So that's at Kansas. That's interesting.
I feel like Jesse Daniels' work.
Yes.
And Bonnie Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like both of them, I remember watching, but Bonnie's dissertation I feel like was maybe about social, digital media communities. But I feel like they both would have something to contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Jesse and Tressie have a book on
they do.
Social media engagement for sociologists.
Yeah, yeah.
And like the
and I also always feel like there's that. There's that one graduate student who's always doing something really interesting that doesn't fit into any neat box. They either have an interesting research question or they want to do a different kind of. I feel like that is already happening, I imagine, in some places, and we just don't spotlight it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So Maria from Duke says that, she says, hi all. We've had the conversation about doctoral learning outcomes and including public engagement skills in learning outcomes in a very limited way as part of a single lunchtime presentation on using PhD portfolios in lieu of comprehensive exams. PhD students in at least one department are encouraged to include public-facing materials in their portfolios. I know this is something that the American Historical Association has been pushing as well, that, you know, this doesn't necessarily require entrenching in learning outcomes or institutionalizing or really even changing a whole lot how normal operations are done, that doing things like requiring a lay abstract of your seminar papers and or maybe each chapter of and then of your entire dissertation. You know, those are kind of simple things that don't add a huge extra burden on students or faculty, but that really at least get students starting to think about this kind of thing earlier on. Okay, we've got some more comments from Kansas, from Nicole. She says, integrating this into the curriculum has been difficult in some departments, less difficult in others. We have a couple of faculty champions in theater, English, and gender studies. So yeah, I think that really just depends, that really varies campus to campus, because I've heard from other NextGen folks that it's on their campus, it's the English department that's really entrenched, and they won't, you know, they won't budge on any of this. And in some campuses, it's the history folks, you know, and so it's interesting that it doesn't seem to be really consistent across disciplines and really is campus specific, which kind of brings me to a question we got earlier from Kim, who's at Barnard. She wanted to talk about how humanities conferences might be more helpful and open to scholars pursuing an alt-ac career. I think, you know, I know that both AHA and MLA have been adding sessions in recent years to their programs specifically on these issues, and have gotten some funding from Mellon to do more exploring about this. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Tricia.
One thought I had, I was thinking when you were saying that, I'm going to my first National Women's Studies Association conference in November. There's going to be a roundtable on written and unwritten. And I was sort of struck by how the conference, in part because it's the National Women's Studies Association, aims to appeal to both academics and quote-unquote activists, right? Community people who are engaged in the projects that the National Women's Studies Association thinks are important, whether they're in the academy or not. And I don't know that's gonna be like. And I don't know, I'd be really curious to know how many people who are outside of the academic model are, you know, present their work, and how much dialogue happens across that boundary. But I think there are a couple of things. I think it depends on who's planning conferences, who's asked to plan those conferences, who their keynote and plenary speakers are, and what their focus is. It's one thing to have one panel on, you know, quote unquote alt-ac. I've come to hate that term. It's another thing to feature on one of your plenaries somebody who's actually productively productively has a career. I think some of the challenges is that it depends on the conference, right? So many conferences, I was thinking about the whole conference culture, where I think it started and where it is now, and how big they've gotten, and how, you know, people go to them for different reasons. But I think that, I don't think it's enough to have a panel here or there. I think it has to be, I think these questions about what work we're doing and how we're doing that work, I think those are big questions. And I'm going to point to the Shakespeare Association. It was a plenary panel. You know, that signals to me, I'm not part of that organization, that they thought it was important enough to give it that space. And I think that if you really want to have that conversation, you have to make sure that you include and make it possible for people who actually are not already part of that group to be there. And it includes extending invitations and finding funding in some instances, and lowering the registration fee. They're out of control. I'm sure everybody feels justified in them, but, you know, if I'm a person who's not on the tenure track, and and the registration fee for a conference is $100 and something, $200 and something. Unless my employer is going to pay me to do it, I don't know how I get there. And it ends up whether it means to or not becoming an obstacle. I was at a conference where at the sort of the graduate students, I'm not going to name the conference, where the graduate students in one of the plenaries really pushed back and said, you all are speaking from the position of tenured faculty. You think you get the job market. You don't really get the job market. You're telling us we should, do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and you're not providing the resources or the training, and you're not valuing that work. And so I think a dialogue between the people who are the most vulnerable in this conversation, and that would be graduate students, and the people who have the most power, I think a real dialogue would be important.
So we had a question from Louisa at Binghamton who asked whether we can share and discuss some of our experiences with diversity in doctoral programs. She gives some context here. So in SUNY Binghamton, our students are diverse in various different ways. We have first-generation college students, international students, African American and Latino students. I'm curious about the profiles of diversity in different universities. It would also be nice to learn something about respectful and productive ways to run a diverse classroom. So that is a challenge, I think, to the group to share kind of
while they're thinking
about diversity on your campus.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, while they're thinking about, because they'll have, that's going to be group. I can answer that last question about respectful teaching in a diverse classroom.
Yeah.
Maybe I can speak to that while people are formulating their responses to the other parts of the question.
Yes.
Because I teach in a diverse classroom, and there are a couple of things I do that, I think when I say this, everyone goes, oh yeah, I don't know that they're revolutionary, but I had a student once who never looked me in the eye, and it really bothered me because I make eye contact, I'm a lit professor, and she never looked me in the eye, and I finally asked if everything was okay. Well, she comes from a tradition where it's disrespectful to stare at your professor. You don't look an adult in the eye. It's seen as a kind of aggressive, like you think you're equals, and she knows we're not. And I was so shocked, and it sort of, I think of myself as, kind of open, but it made me mindful of the assumptions I make, particularly about students who may not be so verbal in class, right? And so I talk about that at the beginning of the semester, and it signals to students that different learning styles and different ways of engaging with the text are okay. So I say, I joke about the fact that so many English majors are introverts, and then they get in the classroom and the professors always want to hear you talk, and some people don't want to talk. And so I let them know that, I understand that, but I do want to hear what they think. And so one way to do that is, I hand out index cards and say you can jot down an idea. So maybe if you jot it down, you're more comfortable speaking. I've started using online discussion spaces more precisely for that reason. I've had to be more mindful of, with a lot of first-generation college students, what it really means when they have jobs and careers, and what can I do. I'm not so good at this. I'm working on it. But what can I do to give them ways to communicate with me outside of my office hours? And those are not questions of diversity in terms of thinking of cultural diversity, but they kind of signal in an inclusive classroom space. And then I think it allows students to relax and to understand that, best case scenario, I am trying to figure out the best way to make the space available to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about cultural and ethnic diversity, but there are other kinds of diversity too. There's, diversity of physical ability. People talk a lot about neurodiversity, diversity in terms of lived experience of are you a parent? Do you have debt? Those kinds, and what is that debt mean relative to your potential future earnings and your other debt and your family situation, and whether you are caring for elderly parents or, all these kinds of things that aren't necessarily visible in ways that ethnic and cultural diversity tend to be more visible. But that, I think that when we talk about these issues, we really need to be thinking about those kinds of things as well. I think especially when we talk about careers, because those sorts of situations can really constrain students' choices.
Yeah, are people chiming in? Because I was thinking about another thing that I do for my students. Sometimes if people have other things to say, I can stop because I want to hear.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that sometimes if I'm talking, particularly in my theory class, I can anticipate what different kinds of students might think, and I try to just go ahead and say, I mean, it seems like a small thing, but just, I think it's so important that students understand the classroom as a workshop for their ideas, as opposed to a place where they come and they get information that they just give back to you. And so I really try to sort of, do things that, like, everybody doesn't get to talk all the time, and sometimes we just have to sit quietly and think about something. I let students know that a conversation that starts on one day that seems over, that we can always revisit things. But I don't know if this is, I think this is just how I teach. And so, and I'm at a diverse institution so that students don't necessarily have the burden of representation that I know. I was the only Black English major at my college. When I went to graduate school on my first day, the secretary, I was a diversity fellow, and there were 3 of us, and she said, I can't tell you all apart. And so I experienced that, but then I went into a teaching experience where the diversity is just there. And it tends to be a diversity in terms of, not in the way that I talk about diversity. So I'd really be curious to hear what other people think.
Yeah, so Nicole from Kansas has chimed in. She said, perhaps predictably, our departments with diverse faculties tend to have more diverse graduate students. And feedback from graduate students has been that students gravitate to departments where there are faculty they can relate to, which makes a lot of sense. I haven't heard from anyone else, so.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think it's because maybe, I don't know if it's people don't have things to say or, I think that understanding that there are different ways to make yourself accessible to graduate students especially, I think it's easy to forget how much graduate students feel they have to perform a kind of impenetrability, right? We don't really reward people for showing that they're vulnerable and that they don't know things. You're supposed to go in and show that you're the smartest kid in the room. I say kid because I'm almost 50 now, so I can talk about graduate students as kids. And I think that, I remember, for example, the graduate professor who just took a few of us out for drinks. I know that seems really small, but in a predominantly white department, and she said, I just think you all, I want to hear how you're doing, and letting us talk about our work in a different space. I didn't have any Black faculty in my field. I think there was maybe 1 or 2 Black professors in my graduate program, but they really signaled in myriad ways that they wanted diversity in the student population. And a lot of it had to do, I'm going to go back to my other question, the research and the reading that they asked us to do made it okay and welcoming to graduate students of color who were interested in questions of race or gender or queerness. In other words, the way they taught their courses made, I think, a lot of us feel like, oh, okay, if I want to ask this question, the professor isn't going to look at me like I'm crazy. They're not going to be defensive. They're not going to say, I'm not interested in that other stuff. There was a lot of room for it in my classes.
So it looks like Louisa has her hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you, Louisa, so go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Hi. Thank you, everybody, for a very interesting discussion, and thanks very much, Patricia, for your exposition. I just thought that since I asked the question, I did have something to share, and since nobody else was raising their hands, I'll share my story, if I may. we have one of our students is a diversity fellow. She's African American, and she was very concerned about teaching a course to students who are not African American. And she asked me a long list of questions, and I thought that the easiest thing that we could do, and she and I worked together in running a workshop with the students in my graduate seminar, which in that year were really very diverse. It was about 20 students, and I think only 2 of them were not diverse, but they were diverse in very different ways. And what we wound up doing was think up of a question and had the students work in pairs with these questions for introduction. Think about something that you just know your pair doesn't know about you, and that it would be nice if you knew. The thing that I just know nobody realizes about me, and would be nice if they did, is that I practice Tai Chi Chuan very seriously. So it's this kind of question, and she and I worked out the pairs of the students so that they would be very diverse. And when we brought the class together, you had to present your partner. You had to give the answer that your partner had given to the question. And that somehow, it's a very simple exercise, but it was a good start for getting people talking about their different experiences. So I learned that one of my students, who is from Saudi Arabia, had spent the first 7 years of his life as a nomad. I would never have guessed that. I'm done.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Louisa.
I love that. I mean, I think that this, because what I love about it is that it kind of nudges people to consider one another outside of the identity they might want to label. They just want to stop there. I think that's a really hard question for graduate students of color who are teaching topics that in predominantly white spaces. I mean, I wrote a little bit about this. I wrote a series of blog posts called Teaching While Black from the vantage point of a professor. But I do think that there has to be a conversation. You don't just send in you don't send any graduate student in, right? There should be pedagogy, training should be part of graduate school. You don't just put graduate students, anybody, in front of a classroom. But I think that 2 things, I would have that conversation about what they might anticipate and how to manage it, and I wouldn't limit that conversation to the graduate students of color. I think that goes back to my other point that that sometimes we just think of these issues as that should only be addressed to people of color, but it would be good for other people to hear, to focus on those experiences and center those experiences. But if graduate education from the get-go can explain, don't tune out when you hear, if you're a person of color and you're teaching that you might have these problems, you should pay attention. And also, you should listen and not just necessarily chime in and say, that's my experience too, because the stakes are different. And so I think there can be a really rich conversation about, pedagogy and diversity and what it means to take space in the classroom as a person of color.
I was wondering if maybe sort of in closing, Tricia, you might talk just really briefly, I mean, kind of in this same vein, but share a little bit about your thoughts about how the book has taken on what you call sort of a life of its own, or been used in ways that you didn't expect, which I think is just kind of going more in this vein about what we think will benefit students of color really ends up benefiting a broader population.
Yeah, and I don't know if she's still on, but Kim Hall anticipated this, and so some of this is just my own, the way you think of your own work in limited ways when people around you can see, it's how it's possible in other ways. But I was surprised that people who were part of the humanities ecosystem, who were not faculty, wanted and needed the book. It's interesting to me that, for example, administrative assistants at other institutions got the book, read the book, and said, this is our experience too. When I started this book, I wanted to make the claim that the issues of diversity are heightened in the academy because the promise of a lifetime appointment makes everyone super anxious. But I didn't think I could prove it, and that's bearing itself out. And so organizations are reading the book that are sort of academic adjacent. I imagined it, this is going to sound so comical, I imagined it primarily for faculty of color. There was a dean at a school that bought copies for the book for all the new faculty coming in. I love that, not just for the sales, but it means that everyone's having this conversation. Librarians are invested in the book. I was surprised that people outside of the humanities and social sciences who were like, we need this kind of book for us, that some of the issues are pertinent, but there are other challenges that we face. Corporate organizations are interested in the book and have talked about reading the book, and just how what people focus on. One of my favorite tweets was a woman who said it's like having a kind of mentor relationship with the people who contributed to the volume, and she found it, and I did kind of imagine that it would be both a cautionary tale and bracing. I was surprised. There's an essay in the book about, it's called Spanish is Our Language Too, and it's talking about building a Chicana Studies department and the politics around that. And that question of language came up. I was teaching a theory course, and we were talking about borders and border identity, and I heard myself talking about some of the questions that came up in that chapter. It wasn't about, tenure, diversity, or inclusion, but it was this question of language and identity and ideology.
So before we go, I have a few things that I want to wrap up and talk about, but I want to first of all thank you, Tricia, for being here and for kind of facilitating this conversation and giving us lots of things to think about and a way to frame these really complex and multifaceted issues that we knew we weren't going to solve in 2 hours. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, and I'm so glad that people asked such good questions even when I didn't have answers. Thank you.
First of all, Amy from Princeton wanted me to let everyone know that they are hiring, and they're looking for qualified candidates who are passionate about working with PhDs. So if you know anyone like that who is interested in being, I accidentally deleted the exact titles of the positions, but basically they're searching for someone in diversity and inclusion, and also someone in student support, I believe. And she said you could find those on the Princeton HR website. So we will, I think maybe I'll ask her to send me the links and we can distribute those among the group so that everybody can have an opportunity to look those over and see if they know anyone, maybe some current students or recent graduates who might be interested in something like that. I also wanted to let you know that Tricia has put together a handout of further reading for us, and that you can access in this, I should have mentioned this earlier, but you can access it in the webinar right now in the handouts bar. If you can't see it, you have to go to your view option on your dashboard and click handouts so that you can see it. But you should be able to download it right there, or I will also be sending it out with the webinar recording. So you will have the opportunity to see this again. I'll also make sure that you have access to that discount code that Tricia showed us earlier in case you're interested in purchasing your own copy or copies of Written Unwritten. So we have another webinar scheduled for June 21st, 1:30 Eastern Time, and we're going to be talking about next steps for NextGen. This was originally the Moving Forward Without an Implementation Grant session, but I I didn't want to give the impression that there would not be implementation grants, because as far as we know, there will be implementation grants moving forward. And so but I think we all need to have a conversation about how to sustain the NextGen work that we're doing, even in the absence of external funding, whether with or without it. So I think that's a conversation worth having. Hopefully you agree and you'll join us for that. Also, just a reminder that your white papers are due to NEH on June 30th, and the guidelines for those are available on the consortium resource page, but also I'm available for any questions you have, or to look yours over if you'd like another pair of eyes. So I'm happy to serve that role if you would like some extra feedback. So with that, I think that's everything, and I want to just thank you all for being here and for engaging with this really important topic today. And good luck with everything, and enjoy your summers.